Hello and welcome to our program. Our guest today is Dennis Rodgers, who is a social anthropologist and who's also a senior research fellow at the Brooks World Poverty Institute at the University of Manchester. Dennis, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
You have a deep and a close connect with India. Let's talk about that.
Yes, my connection with India goes back to the 1980s, or in fact it actually goes back even further. My parents first came and started working in India in the 1970s, but I didn't arrive until the 1980s when I spent a year as a child in Patna, the capital city of Bihar, and subsequently we visited India very regularly. And yes, I have very happy memories of my time in Patna, and it's always wonderful to come. I have many friends in India. There was a big hiatus. I didn't visit India between 1994 and 2004, which was very interesting in terms of seeing how the society had changed tremendously.
You have a particular interest in violence and how societies evolve with violence and also the role violence plays. And currently you're doing research based on that. Let's talk a little bit about your research.
Initially I did a lot of research on gang violence in Central America, and since last year I've been working in India on urban violence more generally, not necessarily specifically gang violence, in Patna. This is part of a larger comparative research project which involves studies in Kenya, in Nairobi, in East Timor and in Chile. And the Patna case study was carried out in collaboration with the Institute of Human Development here in New Delhi. With several researchers from this institute, I spent 3 months last year in Patna, and we developed multi-phased research, drawing both on qualitative and quantitative research methods. We were particularly interested to understand the dynamics of urban violence in Patna, because Patna, of course, has a notorious reputation. It was very violent in the 1990s and the early 2000s, but since 2005 everybody agrees to say that violence in Patna has declined and that Patna is actually now a very safe and dynamic city. Bihar, of course, is one of the fastest growing states in India, and Patna is part of this economic boom. So we wanted to understand what had happened, how had this been achieved, and we went about it particularly doing research in slums to understand what the view from below was, you could say.
Conflict is inherent in any society. I think wherever there's diversity, where there's different kinds of people. And when does conflict reach a level that it tips into violence?
Well, this is exactly the focus of the research that we've been carrying out. We particularly think that conflict is inherent to city living. I mean, cities concentrate large numbers of very diverse people with diverse interests in a contained space, and this generates frictions inevitably. But what's interesting is that most of the time these conflicts are managed peacefully through a variety of social, cultural and political mechanisms. Sometimes, however, these mechanisms can break down or no longer cope with situations of conflict, and this conflict can tip over into violence. Now, this can happen in a variety of different ways. It can happen, for example, with a situation becoming chronically violent, so with high levels of crime, high levels of insecurity, which is what happened in Patna during the 1990s. Other times this conflict can be a spectacular explosion of violence. We're trying to understand what are the factors which lead to this conflict tipping over into violence. There is a lot of literature which invokes factors such as high levels of poverty, youth bulges on the grounds that youth are restless and potentially dangerous, or it could be political exclusion. I think some of these factors are more important than others. There is very little work that has convincingly shown a causal link, for example, between poverty and violence. Poverty is often a contextual backdrop for violence, but inequality has been shown as much more linked directly to forms of violence. And in some ways that makes a lot of sense. The poor are not necessarily violent. They're not more violent than other people, but the dispossessed, and particularly when you're faced with situations of injustice, that can be a big motivator of violence in order to try and change a situation. And factors such as youth, the presence of youth on the other hand, are very difficult to really link into violence. If you take youth gangs, for example, youth gangs typically make up no more than 1%, 2% of the youth in a local context. In that sense, having a lot of youth does not necessarily mean that you're going to have a lot of violence. Here, once again, I think it's due to more contextual factors. Youth gangs often emerge as a result of lack of adequate employment opportunities or opportunities, or lack of opportunities to associate and identify with a community, or they can also emerge as a result of exclusion and as self-defense groups in the face of insecurity from the outside. So there's a whole load of reasons why violence can emerge linked to, say, youth, but youth by itself is not a factor.
And this is critical because the dynamics of this are going to come into play, because India has one of the youngest populations in the world and the largest of them.
Absolutely. And youth, in some way, it should not be seen as just as a risk. They're also a huge opportunity. Obviously, the youth are the future. They're the labour force of the future. India is educating more youth than ever. India has a series of new top-class universities, institutes, and these are training youth who will become the kind of leaders of tomorrow.
Very true.
So to look at youth and the youthful population of India purely as a risk factor would be wrong, I think.
Is it true that certain social constructs in certain societies handle violence or don't tip over more easily than the others?
I think in terms of social constructs, what's perhaps most interesting is the way in which for example, coming back to the notion of youth, the association of youth with violence often leads to the youth being constructed as in particular ways. They become stigmatized. And this is how stigmatization can make a big difference in the way that violence plays out.
Okay.
For example, one of the findings of the research that we've been doing in Patna shows the way in which changing attitudes towards the poor, towards slum dwellers, are actually perhaps having an impact on the way in which police patrolling occurs in slums, containing violence in slums, perhaps, rather than trying to reduce violence in slums. And this we have seen also in other parts of the world. In Central America, for example, gangs developed a reputation as being modern-day barbarians, inherently evil kind of organizations. And this led to very, very repressive and hard-hitting government action against them. Now, this actually led to their professionalization. Of course, when you have an action, you generally have a reaction as well. And the gangs, in order to be able to cope with the state repression, began to develop more violent forms of action, became more professional, used weapons of greater intensity. And this has actually led to a cycle of violence whereby some of the gangs have transformed into drug trafficking organizations, and the levels of violence are forever increasing. Coming
now to gender, and there is also, I think there is enough proof to say that women are probably more at the receiving end of violence. Has that also been borne out by your research?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, well, this is not just an issue in India, it's an issue worldwide. I think domestic violence and gender-based insecurity is one of the major issues that has to be tackled in terms of violence. And although it is on the agenda, so far it is not necessary, it's often on the agenda in a very token manner. But I think another one of our findings from the research in Patna is that certain forms of violence, including particularly gender-based violence, can increase as an unintended consequence of certain types of policies. One of the measures that the government took in order to get at organized crime was to ban gambling. And gambling had been controlled by organized crime in Patna, and was a significant form through which they accumulated revenue. Gambling, of course, even that control by organized crime was not all illegal. Some of it was legal, and the government obtained quite a lot of revenue from that. So by banning gambling, government revenues went down. Now, presumably to compensate for this, since 2005 there has been a liberalization of alcohol production and sales in Bihar generally, and Patna specifically. Now, this has led to a proliferation of wine shops and alcohol production in slums particularly, and increased alcohol consumption and increased domestic violence.
Okay.
So universally, in all the slums that we worked in, women and men were in agreement that domestic violence had increased since 2005.
Is it also a fact that lack of access to state authorities and state policing is also one of the reasons why women are probably more the subject of domestic or other violence?
That is one reason. I think the deeper underlying reason is the patriarchal nature of Indian society, and in this India is not alone. Most societies of the world are patriarchal, and patriarchy does shape gender relationships in very difficult ways to move. But it's true that access was important. Another one of our findings was that women complained about the fact that there were no women police officers in local police stations. Although theoretically each police station is supposed to have a woman police officer, in the slums, in the jurisdictions of the police jurisdictions of the slums we worked in, there were no women police officers. Now, we had a very interesting meeting with the Patna police last week to talk a little bit about our findings, and one of the suggestions we made was to put together a mobile women's officer unit to go around slums on a regular basis in order to provide access to women in slums to women officers, because of course it's always easier for women to talk to women about domestic violence and talk about that to a male police officer.
Does urban planning play a role in urban violence?
It's a critical role. I mean, I think it's both part of the problem and also part of the solution. If you look at urban planning in India, certain cities, well, Patna is a good example, but if you look at Delhi as well, the planning of Delhi and of Patna is a colonial inheritance. New Delhi, of course, is a colonial construction. And planning during colonial times was very much a technology of control and regulation. If you look at countries around the world, cities are organized with an area very wide, spacious, with green spaces and wide roads, roundabouts for the elite, the dominating class, the white settlers, and with all sorts of roads, barriers to entry from the kind of other parts of the city, which are populated by the indigenous population, which were very much kept separate. And often the logic for this was justified in hygienic terms about epidemics and so on. Now this is interesting because we saw at the Delhi, with the planning around the Delhi Commonwealth Games, that some of the discourses about spatial hygiene were being repeated. The kind of getting rid of beggars on the streets, of animals on the streets, was very much justified in terms of there's a question of hygiene, and this in some ways echoes some of the discourses of colonial planning. But at the same time, planning shouldn't just be seen as a problem. Planning is also part of the solution. It's through planning that you can actually try and counter some of the natural tendencies for rich to separate themselves from poor, or to take most of the resources because they are better connected and because their parts of the city can often be more easily reached and modified. And I think there's one very interesting element, which is there's been a lot of work, particularly in Latin America and Brazil, on participatory forms of planning, which try and involve local communities, particularly poor communities, in thinking about the way in which their communities can be improved, what are their needs, through debate and democratic debate. And this has been extremely effective in Latin America, and I think is a model which could be very easily exported or at least adapted in India.
So you co-create the society or the structure that you want to live in.
Exactly, but it's a particular form of state-society interaction, because of course the state has to accept to devolve some of its authorities to local communities, and it also has to be in some ways the guardian against particularistic interests, because all local communities will want to generate things through their own viewpoint, generate proposals, generate initiatives through their own viewpoint. But a city, of course, is not just an amalgamation of individual communities, it also has systemic needs. You can't just think about putting a road here, you have to think about how does that road connect to other roads, same thing with sewerage systems and so on. So you need a kind of top-down